What's up, everyone, at all of our campuses? My name is Donovan, and I am one of the student pastors here. Welcome to our brand new series titled When God Calls. If you're new to church or just Christianity in general, you may be wondering what that even means when God calls. Does God have a cell phone I didn't know about? And if he does, how do you get my number? What do we even mean when we say the phrase when God calls? That's a great question. And as Christians, we believe that God has a purpose for each of our lives, and he calls us. He invites us to live in that purpose. And we refer to that as our calling. And we can have a lot of callings throughout our lives, some big, some small, some just for a season, some for our entire lifetime. Whenever God calls us to live into our unique purpose that he's planned specifically for us, that is our calling. Now, this may be the first time you've ever heard of such a thing. It may be even the first time you've ever thought about your life having purpose. And that's fine. But if that's true for you today, I want to make you aware of the fact that the God of the universe is thinking about you. He's thinking about how he has made you special with gifts and talents and abilities completely unique to you. And he has a plan for how he wants to use you for good in our world. You have a purpose. But the burden that I feel as one of your pastors is that if you don't learn to recognize God's calling in your life, then you may live your life without purpose. You may live your life wandering and wondering, what am I here for? What is this all about? Am I just passing time until I die? And so I feel a burden. I feel compelled to help you recognize God's calling in your life so that you can live with purpose. Now, as little kids, maybe in preschool or kindergarten, we're often asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Anybody remember that? Maybe you got a little sheet of paper in class and they ask you, to write your full name and your favorite color, favorite snack, etc., etc. And then somewhere at the bottom of the page, it might say something like, and when I grow up, I want to be ... Anyone remember getting that? If you can remember, I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell them what some of your answers were. You got 10 seconds, go. I remember at that age, when 5 or 6-year-old Donovan was asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? My response, without question, without batting an eye, would have been, some of y'all missed that. Let me try it again. Little Donovan, what do you want to be when you grow up? Now, I understand that that's probably confusing for some of you. Some of you are like, is he okay? Like, something's wrong. Why is his eye doing that? Do we need to call somebody? No, I'm fine. What you just saw is what is known as the people's eyebrow. It was the signature look of the people's champ, a.k.a. The Rock, a.k.a. Dwayne Johnson. Now, some of you may know Dwayne Johnson as a big movie star from films like Jumanji, Black Adam, the Fast and Furious franchise. Who could forget Moana? Or you may know him as one of the most followed people on Instagram, or as the greatest rapper of our generation.
It's about drive, it's about power. We stay hungry, we devour.
Or maybe even from Fortnite. Homeboy is literally everywhere. But long before any of that, he was a professional wrestler named The Rock, and he was my idol. I wanted to be just like him. Funny, charismatic, a true entertainer, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. However, though he and I share being half black and half Asian Pacific Islander, that's about where the similarities end. I was never going to be 6'5", nor super buff, nor do I come from a long line of professional wrestlers, not to mention the fact that I look terrible in spandex. And so at 5 years old, I had to accept that perhaps this was not my purpose in life. But then what was? If you've ever thought about what your purpose is or how you're going to spend your life, it could be a little intimidating. I know some of you high school seniors and juniors and even sophomores may be feeling this pressure at this exact moment as you're asked to decide what you're going to do after high school. What college are you going to go to, or what career path you might take? It can be an overwhelming thing to think about. But what if I told you God has a unique calling on your life? He has a plan that He wants to invite you into so that you can experience purpose and fulfillment in this life. Sounds amazing, right? The only complication, and maybe you've already caught on to this, is trying to figure out what that calling may be. The tension we live in as Christians is that it can be difficult to know the difference between what is God's calling and what is not. And you may be going, okay, Donovan, I believe you. I believe that God has a plan for my life. I believe He wants me to live with purpose, but how do I know when God is calling me to something? Throughout this series, we're going to talk about how we can know when God is calling us into His plan and our purpose, and how we can answer that call. If you have your Bible or you got a Bible app, meet me in the book of Exodus chapter 3. We're going to explore this idea of calling by looking at the life of a guy named Moses. Here's some background on Moses. If you're unfamiliar with him, Moses was born in Egypt, but he was an Israelite, sometimes referred to as a Hebrew. And at the time of his birth, the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians. It was a dark and tumultuous time for the Israelites, but for God's divine planning, by His divine planning and grace, Moses didn't grow up in slavery. Through crazy circumstances, he grew up as the adopted child of the daughter of Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt. And so Moses was essentially adopted into royalty. He grew up in a palace and lived a lavish, unbothered lifestyle, nothing like what his fellow Israelites were experiencing. Fast forward many, many years later, Moses, for reasons that we'll come back to, has abandoned his life in Egypt. He's given up his royal status and started a whole new life in a distant land as a shepherd. He got a wife and kids and pretty much a whole different life, far, far away from his old life. And it's here that we meet him on the day when God called. Exodus 3, verses 1 through 10, this is what it says. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though this bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. And so I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites and Hittites and Amorites and Perizzites and Hivites and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And I have seen the way that the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. Now, we've established that Moses is no longer in Egypt, right? He hasn't been for several decades at this point. And now God, through this bush that's on fire but isn't burning, is telling Moses to go back to Egypt, to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the country, about freeing the Israelites. This is what God is calling Moses to do. Now, even with the context of Moses' background, you may be hearing this and thinking, why? Like, why is this what God is calling Moses to do? I mean, clearly he doesn't want to be in Egypt. He left a pretty cushy life behind there. Why is God telling him to go back? And how can he be sure that this is actually God calling him to do this. One thing that may lead Moses to this conclusion is that the thing God is calling him to is something he's passionate about. Remember when I said we'd come back to why Moses left Egypt in the first place? Let's look at why. If we flip back to Exodus 2:11-12, back when Moses was still living it up in Pharaoh's palace, it says, one day Moses, after he had grown up, went out to where his people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, and looking this way and that, and seeing no one, killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses had passion, a murderous passion, but passion nonetheless. He was passionate about the unjust treatment of his people. He was passionate about seeing their dignity upheld. He was passionate about putting an end to their suffering, but his passion was not yet working within God's plan. He had all this passion inside of him, but no direction on how to use it. He lacked purpose. And his passion without purpose, it led to pain. It led to someone being killed. It led to Moses having to flee for his life because he'd now committed a crime against the people who'd raised him. Some of y'all aren't getting it. Let me help you. Having passion without purpose is like having pedals on your bike without handlebars. You can accelerate down the street, but if you can't control which direction you're going, it's going to end in a wreck, which is what happened to Moses. So he flees to the desert and is hiding for decades until God calls him. He calls him to return to Egypt to tell Pharaoh that it's time to let his people go. And when you and I first read this a few minutes ago in Exodus 3, we may have thought, that's kind of random. Dude's just shepherding his sheep. Like, why is God calling Moses to this? He clearly left Egypt in his rear view a very long time ago. But when we understand that this calling speaks directly to one of the passions of his heart, it begins to make more sense, doesn't it? Moses may have had doubts about whether he was qualified to do what God was asking him to do, and we'll see this in future weeks. He may have had questions about whether Pharaoh or even his own people would take him seriously, but he couldn't deny what he heard God calling him to was something he was passionate about. His passion for his people had always been a part of his purpose. He just didn't know it. Similarly, you may not know at this moment what your purpose is, but I want to encourage you to pay attention to what you're passionate about. Pay attention to what passions God has placed on your heart, those things that get you fired up, that draw an emotional response out of you. Pay attention to those things because the things that God has made our hearts to care about are often the things that he calls us to. Remember, we're trying to answer the question, how can we know when God is calling us to something? Well, one way is to ask yourself, does what I sense God calling me to align with what I'm passionate about? Moses, even as a young person, was passionate about the freedom of his people. God gave him a heart that ached when he saw their suffering, but God hadn't revealed his calling until he spoke to Moses through that burning bush. Sometimes you and I, we must be patient. We must wait on God. We must listen for his voice to reveal his plan. And we'll practice that throughout this series, listening for God's call. But if we're simply going to act on our passion alone, we'll miss our ultimate purpose. Moses' passion may have stopped one Israelite from suffering for a moment, but God had bigger, bolder plans to deliver them from slavery altogether. And God's ultimate purpose for Moses was to be the person to lead them. You can think of it this way. It's like this. It's like our passion plus God's plan equals our ultimate purpose. I'll say that again. Our passion plus God's plan equals our ultimate purpose. Passion on its own ain't gonna cut it. It's not enough. but it can affirm what we hear God calling us to. When aligned with God's plan, it can act as a sign that leads us to our ultimate purpose. And so, as you head to life groups, I have a question I want you to be thinking about. And we've loved the opportunity for you students to ask your leaders a question to kick off life groups. And so, I want you to ask them this question and be thinking about it for yourself. What is something you're truly passionate about? We'll see you guys next week.